Hello, I'm Phil Netto, and welcome to Deconstructing Lewiston-Auburn and Maine History. In Episode 6, The Forgotten History of Governor James Longley, the 1975 Vietnamese Resettlements. In this first episode of our three-part series about refugee history, we will travel through the mid-1960s and into the 1970s. This was a period of assassinations, protests, riots, equal rights, social change, an impeached president, and the Vietnam War. The mid-1960s and 1970s also became a period of immigrant and refugee political and policy transition that was felt both nationally and in places like Maine. Our state's connection to the war would also involve the forgotten 50-year-old history of its governor, James Longley, and his role in organizing Maine's 1975 Vietnamese refugee resettlements. But let's begin this story with a bit of history involving immigration policy. One of the milestone moments occurred following the civil rights unrest of the 1950s and early 1960s. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed and amended the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. This Cold War landmark legislation ended the U.S. policy of restricting immigration according to race, ethnicity, and national origin. The following year marked another milestone moment in U.S. immigration policy. After years of Cuban refugee arrivals that began in 1959, President Lyndon Johnson signed Public Law 89-732 on November 2nd, 1966. These amendments to the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act would become better known as the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act, the CAA. After Fidel Castro's 1965 proclamation that Cubans who desired to immigrate to the U.S. would not face any, quote, penalty or consequence, unquote, for leaving their country, the U.S. opened the door for Cuban U.S. citizenship. By August 1966, there were 165,000 paroled U.S. Cuban refugees without legal permanent status, or LPR status. Johnson signed the 1966 CAA with near unanimous congressional support that would include a trade embargo specifically intended to, quote, topple the communist government, unquote, led by Castro. The CAA would also grant LPR status to any Cuban resident living in the U.S. for more than 1 year and to any Cuban legally or illegally entering the U.S. The CAA made any Cuban reaching the U.S. shores or border a quote-unquote meritorious asylee. This designation immediately qualified them for LPR status and a path to citizenship, something never granted to any other nationality to this day. In 1960, the Cuban U.S. population was 79,000 people. By 1970, the number grew to 439,000. As of 2020, it is estimated that 1.38 million Cuban refugees have entered the U.S. The CAA also reflected the federal government's willingness to use legislation for both humanitarian and political goals, like defeating communism, something that dated back to 1948, when President Truman approved legislation to assist World War II refugees. 1970 also marked another notable moment in U.S. immigration history. It would be the last year with a declining number of immigrants living in the country. After rising for some 80 years, the number of U.S. immigrants dropped after 1930. It was 2.2 million in 1850, grew to 14.2 million in 1930, and then declined to 9.6 million in 1970. But from 1971 to 1980, the number increased to 14 million immigrants. Between 1981 to present day, the number grew by another 32 million people. The 1960s was also a decade where mounting U.S. concerns about global communism led to the introduction of non-combatant military personnel in Vietnam in the mid-1950s and early 1960s. That changed on March 8, 1965, when Marine Battalion Landing Team 39 and its approximately 1,500 Marines landed on Red Beach Number 2. The Marines would be met by a welcome party of, quote, Vietnamese university students, led by a vanguard of pretty girls holding wreaths of flowers, unquote. By June, 82,000 more combat personnel arrived in the country. Their task was to provide military support for South Vietnamese forces fighting against Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnamese communist troops and Minh's South Vietnamese communist sympathizers, the Viet Cong. Gallup poll surveys were initially supportive of the war, but beginning in July 1967, polling consistently showed that the majority of U.S. residents did not support the war. By 1971, that support dropped to 28%. The war also displaced millions of refugees. When the U.S. troop strength peaked at 543,000 in April 1969, quote, an estimated half of South Vietnam's 20 million people, unquote, were displaced in country. Between 1965 and 1972, the United Nations provided refugees with agricultural, health, and reconstruction support. The UN assisted approximately 2.7 million displaced people, or DPs, who left South Vietnam and traveled to North Vietnam. Many of these South Vietnamese DPs were escaping the growing military ground war. In contrast, many North Vietnamese relocated to other parts of their own country when the air bombing began in areas of North Vietnam. The last U.S. troops withdrew from Vietnam on March 29, 1973, following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords on January 27, 1973. The North Vietnamese did not hesitate to violate the peace agreement after the signing of the accords and the military's departure. Nixon's resignation in August 1974 only emboldened the North Vietnamese in their fight against the ongoing presence of the U.S. and South Vietnamese governments and military's presence. In 1974 and 75, North Vietnamese troops escalated military operations. Their successes in South Vietnam resulted in 100,000 refugees evacuating northern South Vietnam and traveling south to Hue. The North Vietnamese would soon capture Hue and made it clear that they would continue fighting until the South Vietnamese surrendered. President Gerald Ford would start 1975 with his State of the Union speech on January 15th. He stated that, quote, the state of the union is not good, unquote. His comments reflected the challenges associated with high unemployment, an economy in recession, and higher inflation, but he also spoke about possible solutions. Ford's only reference to Vietnam were the congressional restrictions that hampered the president's ability to conduct foreign policy. That would change on April 10, 1975, when Ford addressed Congress again. In his speech, he updated Congress on policy areas showing improvement since his State of the Union address in January. He also publicly stated that safety concerns required the U.S. to pull out the remaining 6,000 Americans who were still in Vietnam. But according to the military monograph, The Last Flight from Saigon, the number was closer to 8,000 and consisted of Americans and U.S. contracted, quote-unquote, third country nationals. Ford also stated publicly that the deteriorating situation in South Vietnam warranted evacuations for the Vietnamese orphans and, quote, the tens of thousands of South Vietnamese employees of the United States government, of news agencies, of contractors and businesses for many years whose lives with their dependents, unquote, were in grave danger. Ford added that the U.S. must do so because it had, quote, a profound moral obligation, unquote, to do so. The events preceding April 10th may have influenced Ford's April 10th speech. On April 1st, 1975, the South Vietnamese ambassador to the United Nations appealed to the U.S. for assistance to evacuate refugees, which included an urgent need to airlift 2,000 orphans from Saigon. On April 3rd, 1975, President Ford initiated Operation Baby Lift. The first flight with 228 orphans on board and a total of 318 souls on the flight left Tan Son Nhut Air Base on April 4th at 4:03 a.m. Saigon time. After 12 minutes in the air, the plane suffered a rapid decompression event that blew off the rear cargo door, ejecting debris that damaged flight controls. The aircraft crashed 2 miles from the Tan Son Nhut runway, killing 78 of the 228 orphans, 35 of the 36 U.S. Defense Attaché Office escorts, 11 Air Force personnel, and 3 civilians. The event was a global story within hours, but President Ford and the military elected not to interrupt Operation Baby Lift. Between April 2nd and May 6th, 2,678 orphans were flown into the U.S. by military air command aircraft and contracted planes, contrary to many reports that have the number at 2,000 orphans. Evacuations would not only involve orphans, but other children, adults, and entire families. Sometime around April 19th, the Department of Defense began preparations for receiving up to 200,000 refugees from Vietnam. Beginning in late April and continuing through the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 2 waves of refugees were seeking a way out of Vietnam. Their panicked departures reflected their fear and uncertainty about the collapsing nation. The first wave, which began in the last days of April and ended with the fall of Saigon, involved approximately 86,000 Vietnamese and Americans. The evacuees involved U.S. Embassy staff and its ambassador, along with, quote, several high-ranking Saigon civilian and military officials, unquote. On April 30th, 1975, the last day of the U.S. evacuation, 6,968 people were airlifted out of Saigon, including those taken from the rooftop of Saigon's U.S. Embassy. That same day, barges also transported 6,000 additional people to safety. According to U.S. Army records, the U.S. military combined forces evacuated 244,756 refugees between April 1st and April 30th. That number represented 51,188 military airlifts and sea lifts for another 193,638 refugees, all of them delivered to destinations beyond Vietnam. From Guam and other Pacific locations, U.S. destinations accommodated 138,869 refugees. U.S. processing centers registered and greeted refugees in locations that included the military bases at Fort Chaffee in Arkansas and Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. Fort Indiantown Gap was an Army installation, often erroneously identified by the press as a town named Indiantown Gap, 3 separate words, and the location that would eventually house Maine's Vietnamese refugees. The resettlement effort was an extraordinary achievement given that the U.S. State Department had initially projected in April 1975 that 50,000 Vietnamese refugees would arrive in the U.S. But we know now that they would eventually process 80,000 more refugees over the original estimate. The more than 130,000 predominantly Vietnamese U.S. refugees also experienced the same U.S. dispersion policy goals established in 1962 with the Cuban exiles. One study showed that the Indo-Chinese had been resettled, by many refugee resettlement programs in, quote, 813 separate zip codes in every state, including Alaska, with about two-thirds settling in zip code areas that had fewer than 500 refugees, with less than half sent to the state of their choice, unquote. Not long after the chaotic final day of evacuations out of Saigon, President Gerald Ford received two letters from Governor James Longley, dated April 30th, 1975. Although there is no indication of when either letter arrived in the Oval Office, the letter listed first in the Ford Library microfiche tape reflects Longley's support for the president, and that he wrote the letter not, quote, as governor of Maine, but as an individual citizen, unquote, and that he started that day with his, quote, thoughts and prayers, unquote, for the president and his wife, Betty. In the second letter, Longley wrote that the state of Maine would do whatever it could with summer camps, quote, to serve as a temporary bed and board situation for any displaced Vietnamese children, unquote. Longley's letter pledged the state's resources to help the orphans and marked the beginning of the state's interest in resettling Vietnamese refugees in Maine. It would also become the first and only time that Maine government would organize a large-scale refugee reception and placement program. Nationally, a majority of U.S. residents did not embrace the arrival of Vietnamese refugees. A May 1975 Gallup poll question regarding refugees being allowed into the U.S. revealed that 54% of Americans opposed the resettlement of Vietnamese refugees, with 36% supporting their relocation and 12% remaining undecided. The U.S. House of Representatives joined the opposition chorus by voting to initially oppose an aid package for Vietnamese resettlements on May 2, 1975. Many representatives expressed concern about resettlement impacts with an unemployment rate already hovering around 8.3% nationally, but Congress would eventually approve President Ford's funding request. In California, Governor Edmund Jerry Brown Jr. opposed the Vietnamese resettlements out of concern that refugees would depress wages and fill jobs that nearly 1 million unemployed Californians needed during this period of high joblessness. As a solution, Brown offered a plan requiring the federal government to create a new job for every refugee seeking one, which Congress did not pursue. Brown's position would eventually change about the Vietnamese. In 2015, Brown met with Vietnamese government officials to discuss the $9.2 billion in trade between them and how it could be improved. Today, the 770,000 Vietnamese in California represent the largest state population in the country, and 36% of the 2.2 million Vietnamese living in the U.S. Opposition to accepting Vietnamese refugees could also be found at Niceville, Florida's Eglin Air Force Base in 1975. Military personnel believed that the U.S. should have continued to fight the war and circulated a petition that confirmed their intentions, quote, not to work on building any tent city, unquote, for the scheduled refugee arrivals. The petition effort faltered following South Vietnam's surrender to North Vietnam, but other Niceville residents worried that refugees would reside in their town and willingly work for cheaper wages. Niceville's town manager stated that some residents in this municipality of 5,700 people believed what happened with Cuban refugees resettling in Miami would happen in Niceville, and that residents did not, quote, like the idea of them being in the country, here, or anywhere else, unquote. Things would be different in the Maine legislature's House of Representatives, which approved a May 9th, 1975 resolution to support the Vietnamese refugee arrivals in Maine. The resolution occurred after Governor Longley revealed that he had received very few complaints about resettling refugees in Maine and that over 6 Maine families agreed to shelter Vietnamese children. His staff reported that some 125 children could arrive later in May or June with minimal or no state expense, but it would be late July before any refugees arrived in May. The governor also shared to the press that he had traveled several times to Vietnam to assist with the relocation of Vietnamese orphans in 1969. Longley acknowledged his success in resettling approximately 12 orphans in the U.S., with several relocating to Maine. A source close to the governor and his administration shared the following information with me about Governor Longley's Vietnam trip and other details that are not generally known by the public. The source shared that the governor visited Vietnam in 1969 and also traveled to Taiwan and Japan during that period. That he was very close to Senator Ed Muskie, who had attended his funeral in 1980. That Longley's friendship with Muskie may have had some role in Longley traveling to Vietnam as part of an effort to expose citizens to the impacts of war and the U.S. military's role in the conflict. And that the governor's interest in orphans was possibly influenced by his volunteer work at the former Healy Asylum in Lewiston. The source also added that Longley's empathy for orphans may also have been connected to his father, who was an orphan in Massachusetts and later adopted by a Lisbon, Maine family. Inside and outside the U.S., there was significant interest from people who shared Longley's passion to assist the orphans in 1969. Many were in the U.S. military and had served in Vietnam. The one common denominator among those who had success in adopting a Vietnamese orphan in 1969 was navigating the bureaucracy in both the U.S. and in Vietnam. In March 1969, the interest to adopt orphans from people outside of South Vietnam influenced South Vietnam's Prime Minister Tran Van Huong to halt adoptions from people who did not reside in South Vietnam. A June 1969 Parade magazine report from Harold Ellithorpe revealed that some of the approximately 100,000 South Vietnamese orphans, in some cases entire families of orphans, were receiving South Vietnam government and global support with housing and programming. In one case, the organization SOS Kinderdorf opened a new children's village in Go Vap, South Vietnam in February 1968. The village included, quote, 41 separate houses plus school and community center, unquote. The South Vietnamese embraced the concept of this village raising their orphans, but it only supported 600 children. Given the gravity of the orphan situation, it was difficult for the country's government to care for them all. Many around the world would continue to support the orphans and pursue efforts to adopt. Considering the legal and political complexities and the intense military action confronting Longley when he arrived in Vietnam, relocating 12 orphans to the U.S. was an extraordinary achievement. Before he pursued the resettlement of Vietnamese orphans and adult refugees in 1975, Governor Longley appointed a relative newcomer from the Curtis administration to lead the state's first significant resettlement effort. His name was Timothy Tim Wilson, who gained statewide recognition in the 1960s as a successful football and wrestling coach at the high school and college levels. Wilson's work as a Dexter High School educator was also celebrated as he became the state's first Black high school teacher in 1966. Wilson's highly visible state profile caught the attention of Governor Kenneth Curtis, who would provide him with his first state government position. Curtis nominated Wilson as the first chair of the newly created Maine Human Rights Commission in July 1972. A little more than a year later, Curtis appointed Wilson, who remained on the Maine Human Rights Commission, to fill the vacant Civil Emergency Preparedness Director's position in November 1973. The appointment happened 1 month after OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, started restricting U.S. supplies, doubling crude oil prices. That was followed by another price increase in January 1974. Wilson's selection followed the Curtis administration's plan to reorganize state government that included the Bureau of Civil Defense. Curtis made civil defense part of the new Department of Military, Civil Emergency Preparedness, and Veterans Services. The new department established each of its functions as a separate bureau within the unit. As the new director of the Bureau for Civil Emergency Preparedness, Wilson would also oversee the new State Fuel Allocation Office, the Disaster Assistance Office, and other disaster-related functions. Governor Curtis also told Wilson that his bureau's responsibilities would assist the state through the oil crisis facing Maine residents. But the looming fuel crisis would not be the state's first experience with fuel shortages. In January 1973, Maine anticipated the, quote, prospects of the worst fuel shortage in its history, unquote. Maine was heavily dependent on heating fuel, and many customers experienced fuel rationing when some Maine oil companies only partially filled fuel oil tanks. Many in the state also hoped that a recent stretch of warm weather would ease the shortage and the higher prices driven by increased demand. However, the reality was that the U.S. had become overly reliant on imported crude oil. After the U.S. oil supply peaked at 9.6 million barrels in 1970, production continued its decline through 2008. Wilson immediately understood the gravity of the fuel shortage crisis upon his appointment on November 8, 1973. Before Curtis's press conference on energy on November 12, 1973, Wilson began to repurpose the former Maine Civil Defense Office. It would be transformed from an office whose original mission was to mobilize for storms, floods, and, quote, for a bomb to drop, unquote, to one that would address any crisis facing Maine residents, complete with a new toll-free crisis phone line. By December 22, 1973, Wilson increased his staff from 2 to 12 people for the new State Fuel Allocation Office, the SFAO. By December 22nd, the SFAO was handling 400 calls a day, representing about a third from consumers, a third from suppliers, and the last third from people just seeking information. Wilson advocated in 1974 that the ongoing fuel shortage required multiple approaches to deal with it. His efforts would entail working with Maine's congressional delegation on proposed federal legislation that included a federal fuel stamp system similar to the U.S. food stamp program. Wilson and his office also sponsored instructional how-to energy saving seminars to help Mainers reduce their energy consumption and save money. What Wilson and the SFAO were doing would not go unnoticed by Governor-elect James Longley, the quote-unquote long shot gubernatorial candidate who became Maine's first independent governor and the first independent governor nationally since Oregon's Julius Meyer's election on November 4th, 1930. In December 1974, Longley would benefit from new state legislation signed by Ken Curtis that would allow Longley to select his own choices for State Department and Commission leadership positions. Bangor Daily News sources reported that Longley would be, quote, cleaning house, unquote, within the existing Curtis cabinet. However, Longley was, quote, most impressed, unquote, with Governor Curtis's appointee, Tim Wilson, because he viewed him as, quote, a guy who gets things done, unquote, and was intent on having him join his administration. Longley appointed Wilson in February 1975 as the State Planning Office's director of the Division of Economic Opportunity, which later that year became the Division of Community Services. Wilson's responsibilities included those overseen by the State Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO, that provided assistance to federal OEO funding recipients in the state. At the time of Wilson's appointment, both the governor and his new appointee did not know that the OEO would become the state office responsible for the state's first large-scale refugee resettlement effort in its history within the next few months. On April 30th, 1975, the same day Longley communicated with President Ford, Maine's new governor announced that he was asking Wilson and the OEO to look into using, quote, resort facilities to house Vietnam refugees and orphans, unquote. Earlier in this episode, I reported on Longley's desire to go to Vietnam to assist in relocating some Vietnamese orphans to the U.S. in 1969. He again restated his concern for the Vietnamese orphans in his April 30th, 1975 letter to Ford that also generated some public reaction. Congressman David Emery stated that although Longley's offer to house refugee orphans was, quote, completely unselfish, unquote, the refugees would be better served, quote, in places where customs, language, laws, and climate are more compatible with their previous lifestyle, unquote. At this juncture, Longley's staff insisted that the congressman, quote unquote, misrepresented the entirety of the governor's plan. The staff assured the press that housing only a few orphaned or displaced children would be temporary and financed by the federal government. Congressman William Cohen also weighed in on the Vietnamese refugee developments on May 3rd and believed that the state and the U.S. should commit to assisting the refugees. He characterized the resettlement of refugees in the U.S. as, quote, an example of true humanitarianism, unquote. Cohen would also preface his statements by adding that resettling all the Vietnamese refugees should not be solely a U.S. responsibility. Cohen believed that, quote, the United Nations and U.S. allies should help out, unquote. Cohen's committee assignment on the Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Immigration Naturalization impacted his opinion about Vietnamese orphans and refugees. As a committee member, he assumed that his vote on the Judiciary Committee to impeach Nixon in July 1974 was the last significant vote of his tenure on the committee. But his work on the Immigration Subcommittee was seemingly as consequential when he revealed his concerns about the resettlements, asking, quote, what will now happen to these people, unquote. On Wednesday, May 7th, Governor Longley would answer Cohen's concerns, announcing that 65 Maine families had registered to sponsor, quote, one or more Vietnamese children, unquote. Longley was emphatic in his desire to assist the refugees, quoting the title of John Kennedy's 1963 unfinished book, declaring that the U.S. is, quote, a nation of immigrants, unquote, and that he disagreed with those who advocated for closing, quote unquote, our doors to the refugees. During the press conference, Tim Wilson also underscored the governor's statements by saying that most of the children arriving in Maine would not technically be orphans because they had individuals inside the U.S., quote, who could look after them, unquote. Conversely, several days earlier, the Longley administration stated that only a few orphans and displaced children would be coming to Maine needing sponsors. The inconsistent early narrative from the Longley administration suggested that the details associated with the age, status, and number of refugees coming to Maine remain fluid. Although there was national coverage of the U.S. refugee orphan arrivals, the limited coverage in Maine newspapers created an information gap regarding their availability. The Associated Press published 2 articles in May about the Vietnamese orphans. One Maine newspaper, AP story, featured a Yale professor who spoke to the U.S. obligation to do more than resettle 2,000 orphan children or the more than 100,000 refugees expected to arrive in the U.S. The professor also stated that there remained many unadopted refugees who were too old, had mental or physical disabilities, and were children of color, or some combination of the 3. The other AP article, which occupied approximately 6 columns, questioned the purpose and success of Operation Baby Lift. This AP story was picked up by newspapers in multiple states, but not in a single Maine newspaper. The Austin American-Statesman's Orphan AP article filled an entire page with praise and criticism of the orphan operation. There was also reporting on how critics of the airlift believed that the orphans should have remained in Vietnam to be cared for by relatives in the absence of one or both parents. The journalists also revealed that a lawsuit filed in federal court was attempting to stop all refugee orphan adoptions until the U.S. government could confirm that no family or relatives were available. The lawsuit referenced by the AP journalist began as a hearing in U.S. District Court on May 1st, 1975, seeking an immediate injunction to stop further U.S. adoptions involving Vietnamese orphans. The court denied the injunction request, but scheduled a hearing for May 12th. In advance of the upcoming hearing, there were press reports on May 10th that the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, would reinvestigate many of the Vietnamese orphans airlifted to the U.S. The investigation aimed to determine if any children were, quote, not really orphans, unquote. If that determination proved true, they would be ineligible for adoption. Judge Williams rescheduled the hearing for May 19th and issued his ruling on May 21st. In the ruling, Williams formally ordered the INS to proceed with the investigation they announced on May 10th. He also ordered the INS to notify, quote, more than 2,000 parents, unquote, caring for the orphans, and to start files on every child airlifted to the U.S. The INS also had to obtain photographs, fingerprints, footprints, conduct interviews with age-appropriate children, and seek an, quote, international agency, unquote, to locate possible Vietnamese parents. Williams' order resulted from listening to conflicting testimony from, quote, more than a dozen Vietnamese and American witnesses, unquote. The order also clarified that his court could not halt adoption proceedings as they were at the state court level. While all these red flags about the potential challenges of adopting the Vietnamese orphans played out in the courts and in the national news, there was little published in Maine about any of it. During late May and June 75, articles about the orphans appeared in states like Washington, Texas, and California. But in July 1975, reporting began to focus on other children who were identified as unaccompanied minors who were separated from their parents and any family relatives during the evacuation. In July, two of the country's largest newspapers published stories about Vietnamese unaccompanied children. The Los Angeles Times would publish a story on July 6, 1975, that focused on the children at Camp Pendleton, located in North San Diego County. Their reporting was picked up nationally, but again, not in Maine. Much of the story covered the complexities associated with their unaccompanied status. For these children, adoption and even foster care were difficult to pursue until confirmation was received that no immediate or extended family connections for the child existed. The article also showed that there were 106 unaccompanied children at the facility. The New York Times followed the LA article with their own report on the Camp Pendleton unaccompanied children on July 28th, the day after the first wave of Vietnamese refugees arrived in Maine. The Times reported that most of the now 170 or so unaccompanied children at Camp Pendleton were Vietnamese and were now living with the relatives or families that brought them to the U.S. Pendleton officials expressed that the same adoption and processing challenges identified by the court-ordered INS orphan adoption investigations were encountered with many of the Camp Pendleton unaccompanied children. The Times also reported that there were 79 unaccompanied minors at Fort Indiantown Gap who all faced similar adoption and fostering challenges, something that would have been useful to know for prospective Maine sponsors interested solely in children. Although Tim Wilson had stated publicly that no orphans or unaccompanied children would come to Maine, the absence of statewide reporting about the dwindling orphan numbers and unaccompanied children adoption difficulties nationally would not stop some families in Maine from remaining interested in assisting only parentless children. Longley's Vietnamese resettlement project would finally materialize at the end of July. But I also wanted to find evidence of Vietnamese refugee resettlements by other organizations, churches, and families during this period. My research revealed that one non-Catholic organization succeeded in sponsoring, quote, 7 Vietnamese refugees, unquote, before the state transported 167 refugees to Maine beginning in late July 1975. The resettlement likely involved the Lutheran International Rescue Service, aka LIRS. The refugees arrived at the Portland Jetport directly from Pennsylvania's Fort Indiantown Gap refugee camp on July 1st, 1975. There is also the bewildering case of Bill and Kim Perry of Windsor, Maine. Mrs. Perry was Vietnamese, and the couple worked to navigate the complex bureaucracy to sponsor a refugee successfully. The refugee in this case was Mrs. Perry's brother, who evacuated Vietnam on April 24th and arrived in Portland on May 16th, all arranged by LIRS. Kim and her husband worked with LIRS to sponsor 6 more family members who arrived in Portland on June 14th, 1975. The Perry sponsorships of this family of 7 is possibly the first resettlement of Vietnamese refugees in Maine. The couple and the 7 family members did their best to live in an ill-equipped 3-room house that now supported 2 families. 23 days later, LIRS had not provided the Perrys any federal refugee assistance funding to a household with an income of only $115 a week. The absence of federal funding support forced the Perrys to contact Mickey O'Malley at the state's OEO office. the same office that would handle the processing of over 150 refugees arriving in Portland on July 27th. O'Malley contacted Lears to seek the financial assistance the Perrys were entitled to, but failed to secure the funding. Unlike the Perrys' experience, O'Malley reported that this would not occur with state-sponsored refugees. Reporting about the Perrys' financial difficulties became non-existent after the publication of the July 24th Kennebec Journal article. O'Malley confirmed that Lears was entitled to receive a portion of the federal resettlement money for administrative work, but estimated that each refugee family member was entitled to receive the balance of that funding, resulting in a payment of no less than $420 for each family member. Regrettably, it remains unknown whether the Perrys ever received any of the federal funding they were entitled to receive from Lears. The Maine Office of Economic Opportunity developed what became the first coordinated and federally funded refugee resettlement and placement program in state history. The Associated Press reported that Maine was also the first state-sponsored program in the eastern U.S. It all began when HEW Secretary Caspar Weinberger formally announced in June that the program would reimburse states for, quote, welfare, medical assistance, and social services, unquote. With the HEW confirmation in hand, OEO officials traveled to Fort Indiantown Gap in early July 1975. Led by OEO staffer Mickey O'Malley, she and her team would interview refugees, quote, about Maine and what opportunities for a new life might be possible in the Pine Tree State, unquote. Wilson also decided that O'Malley's Fort Indiantown Gap team include a Manpower Affairs Office employee and a Vietnamese American bank employee from Depositors Trust. This permitted the OEO group to select refugees with the skills that, quote, matched available positions in Maine, unquote. Screening also included the Department of Health and Welfare as the agency responsible for inspecting sponsor homes as part of the approval process. Lears did none of this pre-screening for the Perry family. On Sunday, July 27, 1975, Allegheny Airlines flew 3 times between the Pennsylvania and Portland airports with 50 Vietnamese refugee passengers on each trip. Quote, the only fanfare surrounding the arrivals was the presence of Governor James B. Longley hobbling on crutches because of a knee operation and greeting the Vietnamese, unquote, at the airport. The excitement of the arrivals was interrupted by an announcement of a bomb threat inside the airport. The incident required the terminal's evacuation before the second plane load of 50 refugees arrived. Airport security found no device, and the plane landed after a 20-minute delay. In response to the bomb threat, the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department assigned deputies for additional security at the refugees' temporary home inside the St. Joseph's College campus. The deputies' security responsibilities included credential checks for all traffic in and out of the college campus. On the same day of their arrival at the airport, the refugees arrived at St. Joseph's College in Standish, Maine. The college assisted the refugee relocations following news reports of Americans opposing Vietnamese refugees resettling in the U.S. The sheriff's office reported that his organization received no threats, quote, but there were some questions about job displacement, unquote. Congressman David Emory and other Maine employees expressed similar concerns, but the OEO assured the public that the resettlements did not endanger anyone's employment. The state's confidence was the product of a screening process that revealed many of the interviewed Vietnamese were, quote, middle class and educated, unquote. The OEO's assistant director, Nancy Keniston, reported that, quote, Bath Iron Works had openings for several special pipe fitters, but the jobs were not being filled by Maine workers because of the complex skills involved, unquote. A congressional report stated that, quote, more than 43% of refugee heads of household were previously in medical, professional, technical, managerial, clerical, or sales occupations, and that 75% of all refugee heads of household had completed at least a secondary education, unquote. The federal funding for the state's resettlement initiative would come from the $405.3 million in financing for the Indo-Chinese resettlement overseen by the president's Special Interagency Task Force for Indochina. The task force was assigned the responsibility of crafting a resettlement placement program funded by the May 23, 1975 enactment of the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act of 1975. The task force would assign the placement and resettlement oversight to the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, which utilized $100 million from the $405.3 million in funding to support medical, educational, and public health support for the refugees. As you will learn in future episodes, volunteer agencies, commonly called VOLAGs, historically provided most of the funding and staffing to bring refugees to the United States. VOLAG services included supporting and operating overseas camps, providing overseas flights and passenger ship travel, U.S. employment search support, healthcare, and other needed services. However, the first Maine refugee resettlements would not be a VOLAG-driven process, but one where the state of Maine OEO became the lead organization to manage funding, seek sponsors, coordinate the arrivals and placements, and provide some direct services for the new Mainers. Congress had not forgotten the historical importance of the VOLAGs and set aside $65 million of the $405 million refugee budget for VOLAG placement and resettlement services. The State Department negotiated the VOLAG contracts and guaranteed $500 for each resettled refugee. Similarly to the HEW and VOLAG-driven process to resettle Cuban refugees in the 1960s, Ford's interagency task force also decided for the first time to expand the program to include state and local governments and also included, quote, private nonprofit organizations, unquote, not affiliated with VOLAG resettlement agencies. Maine joined the states of Iowa, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Washington, who all elected to act as their state's lead resettlement agency. Working through the State Department, Washington became the first state to accept refugees for resettlement. The state did so without the yet-to-be allocated federal funding that would begin in July. The VOLAGs, states, local governments, and nonprofits were all positioned to handle the resettlement and placement services overseen by HEW. In addition to the $500 for each refugee, the HEW approved reimbursements for placement and resettlement costs incurred by eligible refugee resettlement programs. These payments covered a range of expenses for the U.S. resettlement programs that included stateside transportation from the U.S. refugee processing centers to the sponsor locations. Medicaid and state welfare costs would also be reimbursed, along with bilingual and vocational training, as well as public health programs and services. On the same day the Vietnamese refugees arrived in Portland, OEO's Mickey O'Malley confirmed that the first state-managed 150 Maine refugee arrivals had sponsors for the first wave of Maine refugees. O'Malley also noted that the state required more sponsors for the second wave of 155 additional arrivals in 2 weeks. The timing for processing the first group of Vietnamese was aggressive. Because the OEO identified most of the refugees as middle class and educated, their 2-week orientation into US and Maine culture only included, quote, everyday living in Maine, the exchange of money, and using English as a second language and other skills, unquote. They also received employment assistance and services from the OEO federally funded and Portland-based People's Regional Opportunity Program to address, quote, the special needs of the refugees, unquote. On July 31st, the Associated Press reported that OEO Director Tim Wilson had forewarned what could happen without sufficient sponsor families. Wilson warned that the program's failure to resettle all 150 Vietnamese refugees into their sponsorship homes by August 10th would require the state to reduce the number of the additional 155 refugees expected to arrive in Portland on that same date. By August 6th, it became clear that the state had fallen short of their sponsorship goal. Approximately 50 refugee sponsors were confirmed, but 100 refugees remained without sponsors. The situation was dire enough that the OEO, now the newly renamed Division of Community Services, advised federal officials that the state would reduce the next group of refugees to 25 individuals and not resettle any additional refugees in the future. On the same day, Governor Longley expressed that he was, quote, unhappy and disappointed, unquote, about the sponsor difficulties encountered by his staff. Longley vowed to become personally involved with the sponsor recruitment efforts. The governor was aware that there were multiple news reports from state officials of families removing themselves from sponsor consideration after being advised that there would be no children to adopt. OEO Deputy Director Nancy Keniston was one such state official who said, quote, most people apparently thought there would be a lot of children that they could eventually adopt, unquote. Tim Wilson made the same observation on August 6th to the Bangor Daily News, reporting that there were no orphans and that, quote, the only children coming into Maine are with families and are not up for adoption, unquote. Keniston's comments acknowledged that the state had not done enough to communicate the absence of available children for sponsors who restricted their support to non-adult refugees. In all the press briefings and releases, state officials also did not mention if other religious, non-religious, nonprofit, or civic groups had committed to assist the state to find sponsors. Among those not identified by the state included the Portland Diocese, the religious organization involved with refugee resettlements dating back to World War II, and created the Diocesan Human Relations Service, the DHRS, which possessed a statewide network offering social services that existed for decades. The Portland Diocese finally issued a statewide sponsor plea to its parishes in response to a directive from the U.S. Catholic Conference. Following the directive, Bishop O'Leary issued a public plea for sponsors on August 27, 1975, 21 days after Longley made his public plea to Maine residents, and 9 days after the OEO announced they had secured all needed sponsors for the St. Joseph's College Vietnamese on August 18th. As discussed in more detail in an upcoming episode, It is essential to note that O'Leary's role in refugee matters had spanned decades. He was the diocesan chair of the Displaced Persons Committee during World War II. He was also involved with the Hungarian refugee arrivals in the mid-1950s and the relocation and resettlement of Cuban refugees in the early 1960s. O'Leary was the most experienced Portland Diocese refugee resettlement official, but inexplicably spoke minimally about U.S. Vietnamese refugees in 1975. The question is, why did O'Leary or the DHRS not join Longley in his August plea for sponsors immediately? As far back as April 1975, Portland's DHRS board, quote, the statewide charitable and social justice agency of the diocese, unquote, was discussing the, quote, plight of orphans and refugees in Vietnam, unquote, as early as April 27, 1975 at its quarterly meeting, 3 days before the U.S. withdrawal from the country. It is difficult to understand why Bishop O'Leary and DHRS did not begin to prepare for a sponsorship drive for possible refugee arrivals once the federal government airlifted 250,000 Vietnam refugees, or when Maine announced its intention to resettle the refugees in Maine. The limited number of news reports connecting the diocese to the 1975 Vietnamese refugees are somewhat misdefined. One story made reference to diocesan involvement with refugee services and the appointment of DHRS Associate Director, Reverend David Cody. Cody would assume Bishop O'Leary's position as the Diocesan Refugee Resettlement Director in May 1975. The Waterville Morning Sentinel article about Cody's appointment mentions that the NCCB, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the USCC, the United States Catholic Conference, contacted O'Leary regarding the need to find, quote, homes and jobs, unquote, for refugees coming into the U.S. That communication with O'Leary happened the same week he appointed Cody in May. The absence of diocesan sponsors for the Vietnamese was not only a main issue for the Catholic Church, it was a problem nationally. On July 28th, the day after the arrival of refugees in Portland, the Catholic News Service quoted a U.S. Catholic Conference official as saying that, quote, American Catholics have not responded as generously and wholeheartedly as they might have to the needs of Vietnamese refugees, unquote. The official also believed that the, quote, dioceses and parishes have procrastinated in making decisions to sponsor refugees, unquote. On August 20th, Archbishop Joseph Bernardin, president of the USCC and the NCCB, sent a communique to all U.S. bishops that included a quote-unquote model letter asking the, quote, pastors of some 13,500, unquote, parishes around the country to, quote, invite their parishes to sponsor a refugee family, unquote. On August 26, 6 days after the USCC-NCCB president's communique, Bishop Edward O'Leary asked Maine Catholics to assist in the resettlement of 100 Vietnamese refugee families. As the state had already announced that it had secured all the sponsors it needed for the Vietnamese, O'Leary's plea had little value for the state-managed refugees. It is possible that O'Leary was seeking families for additional Vietnamese refugees sponsored by the diocese and not the state, but there is little evidence of that having occurred in 1975. It is documented that DHRS became more active in providing refugee services by the late 1970s, and that they began to directly resettle refugees in Maine during the 1980s, but that was not happening in 1975. This is not to say that the diocese was not involved with the Vietnamese refugees in 1975. Given the size and the scope of DHRS social services at that time, It is very likely that some refugees were utilizing DHRS services offered to all qualified Maine residents, something that has continued to this day with Catholic Charities Maine. There were more stories regarding Maine sponsors that began to appear after the arrival of the St. Joseph's refugees. One case involved the sponsorship of four former South Vietnamese Navy personnel by U.S. Air Force Captain J. Lackland, whose duty station in Utapao, Thailand, provided him with firsthand observations of refugee evacuations. His new B-52 assignment at Maine's Loring Air Force Base and his experience in Thailand fueled his interest in sponsoring Vietnamese refugees. After calling the Pentagon with his desire to sponsor a family, he agreed with their suggestion to sponsor South Vietnamese sailors. The Lutheran International Rescue Service assisted Captain Lackland in moving the sailors from the Fort Indiantown Gap Refugee Center to the captain's house in Limestone, Maine. There was also press coverage of Biddeford, Maine's Fredette family sponsorship of Nguyen Huy Hien and Nguyen Tan Puc in August 1975. Natalie and Willie's decision to sponsor the two young refugee adults had much to do with their son and Vietnamese daughter-in-law's decision to sponsor two male Vietnamese residing at St. Joseph's College. That influenced Natalie and Willie's decision to visit St. Joseph's to meet some refugees. They returned home with Hien and Puck, who had developed a friendship with their son's sponsored refugees while residing at St. Joe's. Both Fredette families worked directly through the state refugee office. A similar story involves a Bowdoin, Maine family working directly with the state to adopt a large Vietnamese family in August 1975. The governor's August plea for sponsors may also have influenced these families to house the refugees. A November 1975 Times Record newspaper article was the only instance in that year where the Portland Diocese and their DHRS agency reportedly became involved in sponsoring and resettling a Vietnamese family. According to the newspaper, Diocese Refugee Liaison Father David Cody worked with Lewiston sponsors St. Vincent de Paul Society and Hillcrest Foods Incorporated to make the Lisbon, Maine resettlement happen. It is also likely that Cody's involvement also helped in managing the details for sponsorship compliance with HEW. The Times Record also reported that the Lisbon refugee family lived in Fort Indiantown Gap before their November arrival. This detail confirms that the state was not involved with this family, as they had officially stopped processing new refugees through their program in August or September of 1975. Father Cody and DHRS likely worked directly with HEW on the administrative details that resulted in approving the resettlement. The newspaper also reported that DHRS would fund the family's Lisbon resettlement. DHRS managed some of the family's resettlement costs without state support by utilizing HEW subsidies. One of the most personally interesting and compelling 1975 stories I discovered in my research involved two families of Vietnamese refugees sponsored by Lewiston residents. My book research in 2020 was the first time I learned about Governor Longley and the state creating a large-scale resettlement program for the Vietnamese in 1975. When I started working as the city's assistant city manager, I had the opportunity to work with Togolese and Somali refugees that initially occurred in 2000 and 2001. I had no prior knowledge of Vietnamese families living in Lewiston and a limited knowledge of Maine's refugee resettlement history. That actually began in 1948. The arrival of the Togolese and Somalis required my involvement with many refugee service staff at Catholic Charities Maine, or CCM, until my retirement in 2017. CCM never mentioned Longley or the state being the primary Vietnamese resettlement agency in 1975. This left me believing that Catholic Charities had resettled the bulk of the Vietnamese in 1975. Catholic Charities does state on their website that 1975 was the year they began refugee resettlement operations and services. It also appears that Reverend Cody and his work to resettle the Lisbon, Maine Vietnamese family in 1975 was possibly the only direct refugee resettlement effort involving the U.S. Catholic Conference Resettlement Agency and the Diocesan Human Relations Service that is now called Catholic Charities Maine. But an opportunity to teach at the Lewiston-Auburn Senior College in 2022 led to my discovery of new information involving Vietnamese refugees sponsored by Lewiston families in 1975. My course focused on immigration and refugee history dating back to the colonial period. During one of the classes that briefly covered the 1975 Maine Vietnamese, I was given information by a class participant regarding a Lewiston couple that sponsored a Vietnamese family. This participant also shared that one of the children graduated from my alma mater, St. Dominic's High School, then located in Lewiston. I also learned that this graduate was a doctor with the Maine Medical Center in Portland, and that the sponsors were a Lewiston family named St. Hilaire. Armed with new 2024 software that possessed a robust search engine for newspapers, I began scouring Maine newspapers with the bits of information given to me in 2022. The first significant find was a front-page Lewiston Evening Journal story regarding Lewiston families sponsoring two Vietnamese sisters and their families. Lewiston's Evening Journal mentioned much of what the LA College class participant told me and confirmed that Richard and Lorraine St. Hilaire of Lewiston sponsored the family of Tang and Tai Lin Tran, also identified in other stories as Mrs. Tang Tran and Mrs. Lin Tran. According to the journal's Nancy Gray, William and Louise Gillis, also of Lewiston, sponsored Lin's sister, husband, and children. The St. Hilaires, quote, responded to a television plea from Longley for sponsors, unquote, following the news coverage of his August 6, 1975 public appeal. News reports on August 18th regarding the state securing sponsor families for all of the St. Joseph's Vietnamese suggest that the St. Hilaires picked up the Trans at the college sometime in late August 1975. The discovery of the Tran family's arrival in Lewiston also generated several other news articles and photos involving the family. The first mention of the family's arrival in Maine may be a photo of the Vietnamese arrivals at the Portland Jetport on July 27th. In the photo, Governor Longley greets a woman and child identified as quote unquote Tran family members from the Chinese section of Saigon named Chu Lan, spelled as two words, Chu Lan. This information aligns with two newspaper stories about the Trans. The Portland Evening Express featured an interview with Tang Tran, who, quote, grew up in Chowlon, spelled as one word with a W. While a Sun Journal interview with the Tran family also described their Vietnam home as Cholon, one word, Cholon, with no W. The town of Cholon is often spelled as a single word by newspapers like the Sun Journal and the New York Times and news agencies like the Associated Press. The story of their escape from Vietnam is compelling. The trans evacuation included the family of Lynn Tran's older sister, Tai Phuong. Both families escaped together from South Vietnam on April 30th, 1975, the day Saigon was overtaken by the North Vietnamese military. A little after midnight on May 1st, the families, quote unquote, paid gold for a boat escape from Vietnam. The families and about 500 others on the boat rendezvoused, quote, off the coast with larger boats, unquote. All 14 members of both families boarded the ship, traveling for 7 days before arriving in Singapore. They boarded another boat destined for the Philippines and then on to Guam, where they resided for approximately 10 days. According to newspaper timelines, the family's journey from Guam to Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, occurred sometime in late May or very early June after a 20-hour flight from Guam. The trans arrival time corresponds to reports of the first Fort Indiantown Gap refugee arrivals occurring on May 28, 1975. At the U.S. Military Refugee Processing Center, they were, quote, given medical exams, fingerprinted, and assigned Social Security numbers, unquote, along with some school services for the children and cultural orientation programming for adults. On July 27, 1975, Tang Tran and brother-in-law Fat Chow's loved ones arrived at St. Joseph's College in South Windham, Maine, approximately 90 days after they evacuated from Cho Lan. The trans story, however, does not end at St. Joseph's. The trans would get additional attention from the press once they arrived in Lewiston. The Lewiston Evening Journal posted a photo of Tang Tran's attendance at a weekly meeting of the LA Rotary. As a guest of Rotarian and sponsor Richard St. Hilaire, Tran would listen to the president of St. Joseph's College speak about the institution's involvement with refugee resettlements as part of the observance of World Understanding Week. Also receiving press coverage was the trans first U.S. Christmas in their new home at 310 Bate Street. The move would reunite them with Lynn's sister and her family, who resided next door at 308 Bate Street. The last discovered photo in my search had the entire Tran family together, including Sherry, the newest member of the family, who became the first U.S.-born family member on January 6, 1976. What is most notable about Sherry's birth date is that her mother was pregnant with Sherry while she was evacuating Vietnam and dealing with extraordinary challenges and conditions throughout her 90-day journey to Maine. So this story will now focus on Tran family member Dr. Lisa Boley, the person first identified to me through my LA College class participant in 2022. Lisa was the family's oldest child, and her parents immediately enrolled her in the second grade at Holy Cross Parochial School, less than 4 months after she arrived in the U.S. When the family moved to Bate Street early in the school year, she transferred to St. Peter's Parochial School and united with her 2 cousins. After 2 years in the U.S., Lisa was listed in St. Peter's 4th grade honor roll in November 1977 and remained on the honor roll until she graduated from St. Peter's in June 1982. In that same school year, her siblings, Danny grade 5, Annie grade 4, Sherry grade 1, also joined their sister on the St. Peter's honor roll, with all of them receiving first honors. Lisa enrolled at St. Dominic's High School, then occupying what had been St. Peter's School. In her first year, she achieved the, quote, coveted principals list, unquote, designation with 5 other students who all received a grade of 95% or higher in all subjects for the entire year. Tran was one of only 2 freshmen to receive the special recognition. She remained on the honor roll until her graduation in June 1986 as one of the, quote, top 10 students, unquote, in addition to being its salutatorian. In September, she was on her way to Boston University. Dr. Bowley would go on to receive her BA from Boston University, her doctorate of medicine degree from the University of Vermont College of Medicine, an MBA from MIT, and did her residencies as a urologist at Children's Hospital of Boston and the Leahy Clinic Medical Center in Burlington, Massachusetts in 1999 and 2000. She was hired by Maine Health's Maine Medical Center in 2000 and has since served in, quote, multiple leadership roles, including medical director of operative and preoperative services at MMC, chaired the MMC Medical Group Board of Directors, and is currently the Vice President of Physician and Advanced Practice Professional Services for the Southern Region at Maine Health, unquote. If only Governor Longley could meet her and the Tran family today. Looking back at the U.S. Vietnamese resettlement experience, we can set the national data record straight. According to the General Accounting Office, 140,676 Indochinese refugees were resettled in 1975 at a cost of over $328 million. 129,792 refugees arrived in the U.S., while others were resettled abroad or repatriated to Vietnam. Between April 1975 and September 1979, 248,436 Indochinese, largely Vietnamese, resettled in the U.S. Most came to the U.S. through the Federal Parole Authority of the Attorney General and the President. A Maine Comptroller General's report stated that between April 1975 and December 1976, 375 Indochinese resettled in Maine. During that period, the state resettled 167 refugees. Most were Vietnamese in 1975, with private individuals and nonprofit agencies resettling another 208 through 1976. An HEW report shows an additional 22 Indochinese resettled in fiscal year 1978, with another 159 arriving in fiscal year 1979. I am not sure why, but when historians speak about Governor Longley, the state's first independent governor, it is mystifying that there is little to no discussion about Longley's involvement in assisting 167 Vietnamese rebuild their lives in Maine. There's also no mention in his obituary of the Vietnamese refugees or his leadership in creating the program. What we know is that Longley journeyed to Vietnam in 1969 to rescue Vietnamese orphans. 6 years later, after only 4 months in office, the governor immediately reached out to Gerald Ford to offer assistance in housing for Vietnamese orphans and refugees on the same day that the U.S. military evacuated U.S. personnel and many Vietnamese out of Saigon. When Longley ran for governor, he committed to serve only 1 term and kept his promise. Longley also fulfilled his promise to President Ford when he agreed to resettle Vietnamese refugees in Maine. He may have been the first governor in the country to make that commitment to President Ford on April 30th, 1975. Cancer claimed Lewiston's 56-year-old governor's life on August 16, 1980. A month later, newly elected Governor Joseph Joe Brennan signed an executive order creating the new 1980 Refugee Act position of Refugee Coordinator for the state of Maine. The coordinator's office remained active until another Lewiston native, Governor Paul LePage, terminated the position on March 4th, 2017. LePage's decision ended the state's direct official involvement with refugee resettlement and Washington, D.C.'s Office of Refugee Resettlement. The ORR response to LePage's decision resulted in the March 2017 designation of Catholic Charities Maine as the state refugee coordinator, quote, replacement designee, unquote, a decision that remains in place today. Longley's handpicked refugee coordinator, Tim Wilson, would eventually work for 3 governors. Wilson's 10-year government experience and public profile resulted in his selection as the associate headmaster at Bath's Hyde School in January 1983. In 1987, he became the admissions director for the, quote, New Maine Central Institute, unquote, in Pittsfield, Maine. But the position he would assume in 1993 changed the trajectory of his life. His longtime friend, Dr. Joel Bloom, gave him a job in 1960 as a counselor at Camp Powhatan, his father's summer camp business in Otisfield, Maine. It was Wilson's first exposure to the camp and to Maine. However, this time, Dr. Bloom, who earned a doctorate in education, wanted his friend to become the co-director of a newly created program at the Otisfield camp that would begin on August 23rd, 1993. The program was created and privately funded by author and journalist John Wallach and was called Seeds of Peace. Wallach created the program following the World Trade Center bombing on February 26, 1993. 46 boys, selected by the governments of each country, traveled from abroad in August 1993 and first assembled in New York for the beginning of the program. They would then travel to Otisfield and begin a 15-day program that would end on Labor Day. The participants, ranging from 11 to 14 years of age, included, quote, 20 Israelis, 15 Egyptians, and 11 Palestinians from the West Bank, unquote. The success of the Seeds of Peace program quickly became well known nationally and internationally. In early September 1993, they would be invited by First Lady Hillary Clinton, who met them at the White House on Friday, September 10th. The campers made such an impression that the First Lady called the president and, quote, asked that they be invited to the White House, unquote, to witness the signing of the Oslo Accords, peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. It was signed by Israel's Yitzhak Rabin and the Palestinian Liberation Organization's Yasser Arafat on September 13, 1993, 7 days after the completion of the Seeds of Peace program. After the ceremony, the campers gave out, quote, Seeds of Peace t-shirts, unquote, to Clinton, Arafat, and Rabin, who agreed to hold them up for TV cameras and the world to see. According to Wilson's website, he left his 13-year Seeds of Peace position in 2006 and is now senior advisor and director of Seeds of Peace, Maine Seeds Program in Portland, Maine. I hope you enjoyed this episode about Governor Longley's involvement with the Maine Vietnamese refugee resettlement and the stories of Maine residents and the refugee families they assisted. Watch for episode 7, part 2, which will cover the early history of refugee and immigrant policy up to the 1960s, 70s Cuban refugee exodus, and episode 8, part 3, which will chronicle the first U.S. and Maine refugee resettlements after World War II. What I uncovered may surprise many of you. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again on Deconstructing Lewiston-Auburn and Maine History.